Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're just going to wait a couple of moments to make sure that everyone's joined the call, and then we'll get things kicked off. Brilliant. So I'm just going to start with a few housekeeping notes, if that's all right. First of all, it's lovely to meet you all. My name is Jack Myers. I'm one of the senior account managers here at Alder. This is going to be a bit of an interactive webinar, so feel free to ask questions using the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Those questions will come up, and if we have time, we'll be able to field them to our contributors. At the moment, I believe we have about 40 attendees from services across the UK. So thank you to everyone who's already submitted their questions in advance. Just as a note, we'll be recording this session. If any of you would like a copy sent you directly afterwards, do get in contact with us. And in terms of timing, we have about an hour, but we believe we might run under, allow some time to get a proper Q&A going. And in terms of the structure, we hope it's going to be a free-flowing conversation with our contributors. Many of you have already attended some of our previous webinars, but for those of you who haven't, Alder is a specialist crisis communications agency. We run webinars on various practice areas, including emergency services. As an agency, our partners advise on a range of issues, from public inquiries to culture reviews to multiple fatality events, inquests, arrests, and criminal trials. Obviously, today we're talking about culture, reputation, and handling media scrutiny in fire and rescue services. Obviously, services are used to some media interest, but that tends to be local and focused on incidents. However, we've seen a recent uptick in media interest in services from, in particular, national broadcasters such as BBC and ITN, particularly regarding workplace cultures at both individual stations as well as services as a whole. So in terms of trends, we as an agency don't see scrutiny letting up anytime soon. That's why we've got our two contributors here today to just talk about these sorts of issues. We have, first of all, have Tim Toulmin. Tim is our managing director here at Alder. He has worked in the media for 20 years. Before founding Alder, he was the director of the Press Complaints Commission, and he's been involved in some of the highest profile media stories in the last decade. We also have Carrie Birmingham. Carrie is an HR and cultural transformation expert. She helps organisations unearth and address their toxic cultures, whilst also ensuring people always at the heart of their response. She's also a former HR director at News UK and is an organisational development consultant, facilitator, and coach. So to kick things off, we're going to structure this conversation around the crisis cycle, so what people do before a crisis, during a crisis, and after a crisis. Us in crisis communications like to think of crises in kind of two different classes. One is those kind of sudden onset issues, which are things like fatalities and injuries. But today we're going to be focusing on that second class, which is behavioural and cultural issues. Classic examples being things like bullying and harassment. With the second class of issues, obviously, comms and HR need to work in concert. So we're going to be looking at the crisis strategy from both a comms and HR perspective. So just to start into kind of that kind of contextual and background to why this is all happening now, I'm just going to first go to Tim. And Tim, I mean, all this media scrutiny, why is it happening now? Do media outlets have an agenda against public services in particular?
Thanks, Jack. No, the short answer is no. The media's agenda is, as it always is, which is to get a good story. So we have to ask why this is a good story. we need to see these recent broadcasts, particularly in the context of much broader sweep of issues that have arisen in all sorts of sectors, starting really with the Me Too movement. It goes to social media and the power of individuals to have their voices heard, changing cultural and social expectations about the workplace and what is acceptable, and so on. It also reflects the frustration that some people have within any sector, that they're not being able to be heard within their workplace. Going to the media for people is a last resort very often. It's something they feel uncomfortable with. It suggests there's an internal structural problem, that they haven't felt able to blow the whistle, or they haven't felt they will be taken seriously, or it's such a sort of all-pervasive problem that they just don't even bother in the first place. So there's nothing particularly unusual about the media focusing on fire and rescue services. It has added interest to readers and viewers because, of course, these people are our local heroes, and anyone who's, like me, has relied on the service obviously puts people on a pedestal. So it makes revelations of shortcomings all that bit more shocking. There's also something about the particular nature of fire and rescue services, I think, which is unusual, which is the large number of individual stations you have. There will be individual subcultures. So it's more difficult to get a grip on your organisational culture overall. And with that in mind, Carrie, I know that you have worked with a very similar structure or organisation to this, with lots of different outposts on these precise types of issues of harassment in the workplace leading to stories. What was the challenge there, and how did you help to overcome it from the point of view of understanding an organisation's culture?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Great question. Well, I think for me, it's probably two things. It's being really clear about your brief from HQ on the sort of approach and tone, but really being in a position to adapt to the local station, you know, conscious of the local area, the culture and experiences that people have, and being, you know, free to explore those with people. So certainly my experience of working in a similar organisation allowed me to both understand that sort of HQ perspective, but also work with the people on the ground, really, and find out what they really cared about. And I think that's what you need to navigate, is those two elements.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, just going off that, Carrie, what does a toxic workplace culture actually look like in kind of practice? And where is that threshold between what some might term banter and that kind of turning into bullying, where HR might need to get involved?
Yeah. So, well, I always think about swimming, Jack, and I know that might sound like a strange place for me to start my answer, but I love to swim. And for me, culture is like the water you swim in. So when you first jump in, especially if it's cold, you know, it's a bit of a shock, and, you know, you respond to that. But the longer you're in the water, the more used to it you get. So if you've been in the water, in the culture, working in the fire service for a long time, you get used to how things are. And so if the water is toxic, you get used to it, you adjust to it. And so it can be really difficult to spot. I always think about the fact that a culture of dignity and respect is about those small interactions that happen in the station every day, with each other, with your support staff, and how people are left feeling after those interactions. Because really, when you talk about toxic culture, it's about someone finding something offensive. And, you know, of course, we all get things wrong. We say the wrong thing because no one's perfect. And it's a meaning that the person you're speaking to can say that they find something offensive, and that your response to that is not to bat it off, but it's actually to understand why they found it offensive, to take the time to explore it. You know, I commonly come across organisations where, you know, their first resistance to me talking about this is that they say, this is just banter. And for me, the answer is, well, that's not an excuse for being offensive. That's not an excuse for offending somebody. So, I mean, in essence, banter is bullying when the other person feels offended, feels upset, feels uncomfortable. So it doesn't really matter what you intended, that you intended it to be a joke or that you intended it to be banter. The question is, how is the other person feeling? And if you don't stop to ask, then you don't know that. You know, at the end of the day, the fire service is a predominantly white male organisation, and so it's its own form of echo chamber, in the same way that we've seen things evolve in the past. You know, I'm old enough to remember that workplaces all had page 3 calendars up on the wall, and we all know that isn't acceptable anymore. And I used to work for the Sun, so I suppose that's a subject I'm very well aware of. And we need to modernise. You know, we need to work outside of our echo chambers. We need to expose ourselves to content, you know, whether that's films, podcasts, books, whatever's the thing that you're interested in, to help us see and understand different perspectives. Because the truth is, Jack, I mean, a toxic culture on the surface looks the same as any other. It's really what's going on underneath the surface that you really need to get to the bottom of. And I suppose that's really why we're here talking about it today, because that's quite hard to do.
Yeah, so I mean, that's an important point to pick up on, because I mean, getting underneath the surface, it's one thing saying that, but often it's very complex issues underlying all these issues. What steps can HR take before such a crisis actually hits?
Well, you can't fix a problem you can't see. And as I've explained already, you know, familiarity breeds comfort, you know, and if you have been in the service a long time, of course, it's hard to see. So my encouragement is often quite simple, which is to try and help reframe those small interactions I just described. So I often recommend imagining walking around the station with your granddaughter or your daughter stood next to you as you do that. And she would hear, see, feel all of those interactions herself. What would she say to you about it? What would she say when you got back to your office or your desk or your station about how she felt about what she heard? Because that helps you get that different perspective. And, you know, the next generation have different views about these things. So, you know, that's one way of helping to see something that maybe you haven't seen before. For some clients, they actually want external help to judge that quality of water. So we offer a service called a culture review, which helps them take a fresh look at their culture and think about what goes on below the sort of polite introductions that people might have, that people might not say in a staff survey. And, you know, I'm often taking the results of an audit like that to a senior person, and they're surprised. They don't understand that that's how people feel, but that's because if you're senior, people don't tend to tell the truth. You know, they filter a lot of what they really think.
So, I mean, okay, so just picking up on that point there actually is, I mean, it's a stressful job on all these fire and rescue services, and teamwork is vital. You know, members of the service are going out to incredibly dangerous situations. So I feel a tension here, which it would be really interesting to get your view on, is when constantly talking about HR training procedures somehow undermine camaraderie.
It's a good question, Jack. You know, I think certainly the emergency services are known for their black humour. So, you know, how do we honour that at the same time as talking about these things? I mean, it is uncomfortable to start saying, well, that's not okay. People, you know, I'm not going to deny people are not going to like it. You know, as human beings, we're wired to look for people like us. And so it is uncomfortable to start understanding how people are different and working with people that are different. But not dissimilar to going to the gym or eating healthily. It's good for you. It's good for your long-term growth, I suppose. So for me, I, you know, invite people to think about what's going on, for them to realise that sort of training and policies aren't enough to change a culture, because people are smart. They know the difference between when you as the person running the station or, you know, in charge of the watch, know the difference between ticking a box. You know, HR said we have to do this. I mean, I used to be one of those people. So I know that, you know, people would leave my office and roll their eyes and say, we've got to do this. They know the difference between that and actually when you mean it. You know, the fire service has seen a switch from the language of sort of fireman to firefighter. And it's really about, you know, continuing that evolution. You know, and it's no fun to be the lead story on the ITN. It's no fun at all. And Tim will say more about that. So, you know, think about the fact that, you know, finding, training, hiring firefighters is not easy. And, you know, you have a shortage at the moment. So when people arrive after all of that effort, they find the culture that you have makes them feel nervous or unsafe or anxious, well, they're not going to hang around. So you'll end up with a vicious circle. So, you know, my invitation is for the benefit of everybody to really be facing into what's going on. And as a senior person, that responsibility falls to you to be a role model. So if you start having different conversations, they'll be able to.
From a comms perspective, Tim, is there also anything that services can be doing to prepare for a sudden influx of inquiries?
Thanks, Jack. Yes, I think there certainly are a few steps that can be taken. And Sarah, if you bring up one of our small number of slides, we're going to be quite slide light today. But just as an aid memoir, here are some things that can be done to help you prepare. So what we know is that the media is still very interested in these stories. And we also know that in a crisis situation, time goes extremely quickly. They won't give you very long to come up with your response, and any delay effectively puts you even further on the back foot. So there are a few relatively straightforward steps you can take in order to get ready, just in case it is you next in the firing line. Now, I would advise any fire and rescue service take these steps, even if you don't know, and actually particularly if you don't know specifically what issue may arise. Firstly, facts and figures. You'll have a lot of information internally already about the nature of your culture through staff surveys, any exit interviews you do, trends in whistleblowing, complaints, tribunals, etc. Gather all that together in one place and make sure your PR team are aligned. With that in mind, understand that very quickly HR and PR will be having to work together in a way that might be slightly unusual. Ensure that they understand in advance who's doing what sort of questions will arise, how they're going to work together in these in this particular scenario, because you don't, again, want to be wasting time with internal politics or answering questions that are just going to get in the way because people don't understand why they're being asked for certain bits of information. Carrie's talked about the audits that you can do, an external audit of your current culture. That's precisely the sort of thing you're going to have to do anyway if you're in the news because of an organisational cultural deficiency. You'd probably rather know now in advance what the actual state of play looks like, rather than feeling you've been bullied into or bounced into, rather, a review of that nature. Scenario plan. Where are the most likely pressure points going to arise? Well, we've already seen, of course, the fact that these types of stories are very much centred on sexual harassment and misogyny and other unacceptable behaviour, particularly with an issue in relation to women. But there are other allegations that emerged, obviously, in the recent inspectorate report as well, which go more broadly than that. So there's enough there to build up a good idea of what type of stories will arise. Therefore, how are you going to respond? Who's going to speak to the media? How are you going to divvy up the roles and so on? How are you going to liaise with your stakeholders? You can rehearse through media training who your spokesmen are going to be. You can test 2 or 3 out. Usually the chief would need to be very much fronting this sort of thing up. But if they're not around, have you got a decent performing deputy, and so on? And also, finally, make sure you've got the right external support in place. You can identify these people in advance. Hopefully you'll all have lawyers, but do you have a media lawyer on your books? Crisis PR, of course, HR, other types of external advisors who are going to be needed on hand to advise really at extremely short notice. So what you can do in advance to get all these steps in place is going to save you very, very precious time. So you will come across in an extremely front-footed, confident way, and that gets you a very, very long way through any media crisis.
Thanks, Tim. I'm just going to hone in a bit on the HR and PR alignment, because we've just had a question in from the floor about how best practice regarding reporting. I mean, obviously in the BBC and ITN coverage recently, HR processes and practices have also been scrutinised. I mean, they've been the focus of much of the reporting. It's about processes not being fit for purpose, basically. So I'm wondering, Carrie, I mean, what sort of ways, what sort of channels should be in place regarding reporting things like bullying and harassment? Other things that should be in place, other things, different ways of doing things that you would definitely recommend
Well, the thing is, if someone's uncomfortable, they're going to tell somebody that they trust. And so the question is, how do you build trust in your station so that people feel they know who to speak to and they know who would take them seriously? There are external measures that you can take which give people places, whistleblowing lines, or ways of uploading information that say that you're concerned. But for me, it's about the conversations that you have in the station and whether people feel able to tell somebody that they're then not comfortable. That's really where I put my energy, Jack.
Fantastic. I think this is a good time to move then on to just the crisis itself, the crisis. So obviously there is a kind of a surge in capacity when media inquiries start coming to the comms department. So, Tim, we'll go to you first. Are there obvious things that people should have in place for the kind of immediate crisis response strategy?
Thanks, Jack. Again, we might pull up a slide here, please, Sarah. I think the most important thing here is your starting point, your jumping off point in relation to the media. What are you actually going to do? What's your strategy? Sometimes a strategy will be about a disciplinary process. It might be reporting the matter to the police. It might be commissioning an external review. You need to decide fairly quickly what the proportionate, most appropriate response is. Sometimes people will just completely deny the allegations and hit back and say it's a load of rubbish. You need to be obviously very confident that that is the case before doing that, and try and chase the story out of town completely, which occasionally does work because some of these media inquiries are a try on, but very few in context, and mostly they do have extremely good case studies. So how are you going to put the needs of any victims first? These people are the most important stakeholder that you have, and their view of the way you've handled it is the most important, because really it's in their hands about whether this story has longevity or not. Your aim is to get this out of the media as quickly as possible and make it a stakeholder issue. And the way you do that is A, having a clear strategy, B, having visibility. The chief needs to front up, go before the media, at the very least have statements in their name, but very often actually just sit down and talk to journalists. There needs to be authenticity in the tone of voice. You need to say sorry if appropriate and mean it, and that meaning follows through in terms of your actions. There needs to be visibility in terms of the actions that are taken next. And I think very often, not just in relation to these types of stories, but generally we will see people get so fixated on the media that they overlook their internal audiences. Your people are also very, very key stakeholders here. They will feel a bit battered, a bit bruised by being clobbered by the media. It's extremely unpleasant. Everyone wants to think that where they work is a good, noble place to be. And these types of stories can set that image back somewhat. So you need to take them along as well, and at a very early stage. And of course, any external partnerships that you've got, any charity partnerships or alliances you have in the community, those people need to be informed proactively about your strategy, the fact you get it, and what the next steps will be. So there's a lot to do in a very short period of time in order to stay on the front foot in relation to one of these crises. But perhaps the most important thing about having the right strategy, Sarah, if we look at the next slide, is the importance of having one line to take. So at its core, having a clear strategy, is it going to the police? Is it going to be a review? Is it going to be a disciplinary? Means that you don't have to go any further in the short term. And this is important because you don't want the story to be in the news for longer than strictly necessary. So you can see recent examples in the news of organisations that have not got this quite right. ITV, for instance, in relation to recent stories, haven't quite got a grip on their one line. Certainly the CBI, regarding the stories of sexual harassment, sexual assault, that organisation that were revealed in The Guardian, unfortunately, they seem to have over-communicated at an early stage and before they got on top of the facts, which meant that the story is still in the news this week, even though it arose several months ago. And one of the one example in relation to the police recently was the Nicola Bulley tragedy up in Lancashire, and what we saw there was perhaps because I'm only speculating, who knows why, but there was pressure from the media, from social media, and so on, for the police to clarify certain facts around the investigation, and rather than answering the questions and satisfactorily drawing another line under the speculation, it gave rise to much more coverage, criticism of the force, and it kept the story in the news for the wrong reasons. A sense of mystery deepened rather than any clarity being brought to it. So it's really important, once you've got your strategy, to be very disciplined. You've said what you're going to say. It's now on with the show so far as the action is concerned. And that action will speak for itself. And then further down the line, you will be able to explain what's happened in relation to your investigation, whatever has been commissioned. And by that stage, of course, matters will be considerably calmer. What you don't want to do is to keep adding fuel to a sort of media frenzy, as it were.
So just on that then, so when you say making it a stakeholder issue rather than a media issue, I mean, so to what extent can you just deprioritize media entirely? Is it a good idea to refuse to engage with media inquiries, hostile media inquiries in particular?
It's never a good idea not to engage at all. Your approach here is to make the story as boring as possible, as quickly as possible, by showing that you're doing the right thing, that you're taking action, that you are briefing the right people as local politicians, external stakeholders, etc., so they're not taken by surprise. It means, above all, doing the right thing by any victims, so that no one really feels they need to carry on speaking to the media. That's the point here. We recognise it's a story, it's a legitimate story, which we need to explain our position to the public through the media on, but we don't want to give it any further, any sort of further ammunition beyond what is strictly necessary. I think one thing that is extremely inadvisable is to refuse to engage with the media when the story emerges. If people think they can hide away, then that's very mistaken. We've seen a lot recently of examples of journalists turning up at people's homes, places of work, places of leisure, and so on. They're very well resourced at the moment, the media, much more so than recently. This goes for newspapers particularly. They've found a very good way of making money digitally after years in the doldrums because of the internet. So they're better resourced. They can fan out and put people on the spot. So again, if you haven't had training around how to deal with being doorstepped by a journalist, then that would be an important element of that prep as well.
On the HR side, Carrie, so I mean, obviously, when the media get hold of a story like this, there is already quite a complex HR process already underway. And so I wonder if we just take an example, say, of a sexual misconduct claim being made by a female member of staff against a male member of staff. I mean, how does the service ensure that there's just an appropriate process taking place?
Well, so while Tim's busy doing those things, I think for me, it's firstly acknowledging that it's brave to speak up, and working from that place. So assuming it's serious, noticing if it's tempting to say, oh, maybe you misread the signals, or maybe you're being over dramatic, because that's where it can go wrong. And putting in place your HR process, which I'm sure is very well laid down in paperwork. I suppose in terms of what it means in practice for me, if I'm appointed, and I often am, as an independent, which means I don't know anybody involved, I've had no connection with that service before, then I will move into investigation mode. If it is a woman, I always advocate a woman doing the investigation because I think it's more comforting for the victim involved. And so when I get those calls, for me, it's about moving at speed. Yeah, these things will have rumbled on already at this point for long enough. And so we need to get in front of the lady in question or the ladies in question and be as specific as possible about what's happened, when it's happened, and what they want to happen as a result. It's not a time for woolliness. So I think for me, that shows the people involved that we're taking it seriously. So I'd be looking to interview the people involved on the record and look for ways to understand their experience and sort of, you know, the things that they have, whether those are WhatsApp messages or text messages or emails or other witnesses that help me understand their perspective of what's happened and how it's happened. I think it's always worth mentioning that at this point, as the investigator, I'm not the police. So I don't have to prove one thing being true or another. That my responsibility is about the balance of probability. So I do take into account the people I meet and how they are with me or how I experience them, and, you know, some of the things that they say and how they say them. And I also take into account the culture. So I'm asking myself the question, do I believe that this could happen here with these people? So, you know, lots of things to consider.
I mean, it already sounds like there's a strong alignment both from an HR and comms strategy perspective about which stakeholders you prioritise, you know, and in what order do you communicate and manage them. So I want to just go back to Tim there from the comms perspective. What is the hierarchy of needs? Is it the same as on the HR side? I mean, where do people sit in terms of kind of individuals versus wider public, for example?
I think that's a great question, and I think sometimes people overlook the fact that there is a hierarchy of needs from a communications point of view. All of the comms need to be infused with the spirit of what is most important from the point of view of any victims, as we've already said. So they're top of the tree. Your own people, very important to the local politicians, regulators, and all these people are in the mix. The general public is an interesting one because actually they are being bombarded with information all the time. There are micro scandals, there are major scandals. To process this type of information, and you know, is quite an ask, really. And unless it is directly related to them personally, then the general public are quite resilient to these sorts of stories. It's much more the impact of public opinion on politicians. Are politicians then going to drive regulatory behaviour that you need to be concerned about so far as the public is concerned? But really, memories are pretty short, to be honest, in terms of the general public. That's why you're absolutely focusing on those who are personally impacted.
Thank you. We do have another question from the floor for Tim. It's about direct approaches. And I mean, I believe some of the reporting early in the year, some fire chiefs were directly approached by broadcasters on the street and caught a bit unawares. So I wonder whether you have any thoughts about best steps to take regarding things like doorstepping or journalists calling people on their personal phones, for example.
I think the starting point is to recognise that the media have a job to do, journalists have a job to do, and broadly speaking, it makes sense not to complain about that, but to recognise it, that they can be provocative, that journalists are allowed to ask questions, to turn up at places, and to sometimes make a bit of a nuisance of themselves if they feel like they're not getting the answers that they want. I think there's a real case for just prepare. The best way of dealing with this is to prepare for the eventuality so that it feels comfortable, because otherwise some people get into a bit of fight or flight mode when they are approached out of the blue by a journalist with a camera crew in tow, and it can feel very uncomfortable. People can get flustered, they can make mistakes like putting their hand over the camera or running away. So it's important just to have a line to take. If that happens, what are you going to say? Usually it will only have happened, though, because they will have not got anywhere through the press office. So it suggests that the initial response was to try and close the story down through lack of engagement rather than in a more sort of transparent way. So probably it means your strategy has been a bit off center, as it were, a bit off key. But you can correct that. I think basically they're doing it because they want your response. So you could invite them in, come and sit down. Of course, come down to the station and talk to me. But you need to be comfortable about how you get people off the phone. For instance, if they're phoning you up, people approaching you via social media accounts, LinkedIn, all of that stuff is how journalists are going to approach you as well. So basically, forewarned is forearmed on that one.
Excellent. We're going to move now on to just talking about what you do after the crisis. So obviously, given the nature of some of these behavioural cultural issues, there tends to be a long tail where obviously you get that initial burst of activity from the media, but then it goes a bit quieter. But obviously, because of the nature of the issue, there's actually a lot of work to do behind the scenes. So I wonder then, going to Carrie first, I mean, in that recovery period, what sort of work should you be doing to repair your culture? What's the sort of best practice you should be implementing, putting into place?
Well, Jack, I mean, I genuinely believe, and this has been my experience, that actually you can improve your culture from an event like this. And I know that might sound a bit of an odd thing to say, given it's often something really difficult. But I encourage people to keep that goal in mind, that a stronger, healthier, more respectful culture can emerge from this because of how you conduct yourselves. And that's aligned with many of the things that Tim and I have mentioned so far. So be as honest as you possibly can about what's happened, and work with your PR and legal colleagues to make sure know what the boundaries of that are, because you've all got slightly different perspectives, and harnessing those different perspectives will often get you the right answer. It's really tempting if you're the senior person, and I'm often stood next to them when this is happening, to go really logical and really formal. And my invitation internally is always to talk more personally about how it's felt to go through this. So how has it been for you to be navigating this, and to find out that people have had those experiences on your watch? And I think if you're able to do that, then the station can heal from what's happened. For me, it's a more personal commitment that we're doing some training. It's talking about what you've learned and what you're going to do about it. Because, I mean, the truth is, there's lots of research that backs this up. Silence is often the root cause of these issues. And so how do we make it safe for people to speak up? I mean, I mentioned it earlier, Jack, with one of your other questions. I mean, anonymous reporting is often advertised as a really good thing to do. And I think it can start to open the door to conversations that haven't been happening. But it is a bit like a flashing light going down the road. I mean, it will tell you the problem, but it doesn't tell you where it is, what it is, and who it's with, by the nature of it being anonymous reporting. So I think for me, we'll often do a culture audit if one of those lights have gone off, as a way of really trying to understand what's happening and build trust for people to open up and talk about what's been going on. I think for those, in charge, really it's a chance to role model the change that you're talking about. So how do you start being different with people in the way that this investigation might have suggested you need to? Both the victims and the individuals accused find these investigations wholly uncomfortable and very difficult, and they often need a lot of support through that. So, how do you acknowledge something really difficult has happened, acting differently yourself to show people that you mean it? I think, Jack, would be my advice.
And similarly, Tim, from a PR perspective, are there things an organisation can do to recover from a crisis like this?
I think there certainly are things. I think the first thing is no own goals, really, and this goes back to making sure that the media become uninterested in this as soon as possible. And the chief means of doing that is to ensure that you're doing the right thing by the victims. The victims will be in touch with the media. If the journalists are back in touch with the victims and the victims are content that things are proceeding well, then that is a very, very long way down the path so far as you're concerned. But it takes a bit of effort, and of course the tone is important as well as the content. The content has to be delivered on. You will have announced various initiatives. They have to be followed through, and in as timely a way as possible, of course, as well. I think some people very often ask about the after stage, about social media, and indeed the during stage, which is how should we respond? How quickly can we resume normal communications activities? And I think the answer is, obviously it's case specific. It's often a little bit sooner than you think it will be, but of course be very alert to anything that looks like it will jar with the story. So your regular comms team will obviously have a plan of activity. They will really need to be bound into your recovery stage, so that they can adapt the communications accordingly. You don't want to be looking flippant. There shouldn't be anything that's misinterpreted, because these things can flare up, of course, again at a moment's notice. This goes back to the idea of no own goals, which is actually sort of easier said than done, because so much is often baked into the forward planning. So I think the key about the social media side is, yes, you can re-engage, and the key to the PR normalization is, yes, you can start that reasonably soon after you want to leave a period of time, but then don't be thrown by people who criticize you for doing it. There'll be a small number of people for whom being in the news for a negative reason is just a reason to have a pop, because they've got nothing better to do. But the overwhelming majority of public opinion will, as I said before, have moved on from a story quickly. And so the main thrust is about ensuring that the mainstream media have moved on as well. Keep your stakeholders updated with the progress, ensure that there are clear timelines as to the progress of your investigation and when it's likely to be concluded. And then, of course, reflect on what has actually happened from a communications point of view. What learning was there for the chief as they sat down in front of the TV cameras, or from more generally in terms of stakeholder management. Put that back into your crisis communications manual or protocol, whatever you have that will help you get through the next one. Let's hope there isn't a next one, but if there is, you've at least got some good learning. So it's about making good on your promises, protecting the vulnerable people, and then reflecting on what you've learned, so that you're much fit for next time.
Of course, thank you. We now have a few questions from the audience, and I think I'll just go to Carrie first. It's about answering internal surveys. So the question says that obviously sometimes, not all internal surveys, the answers are wholly honest. How would you advise assigning value to the surveys, despite your session about kind of anonymizing staff responses making a difference in your view?
Well, they can be really helpful as flashing lights if people are honest, Jack. But the question is, what do you do if you don't know what the problem is? So the challenge with anonymised reporting or surveys is they say this needs looking at. And the question is, what do you do next? And I think with a lot of organisations, what they do is think, oh, well, this will make it better. They'll come up with an idea, a suggestion, without actually understanding what the problem is. And so for me, the question is, what do you do if that tells you have an issue? My huge encouragement is to go and find out what's going on. And so I've mentioned culture audits. I mean, let me say a little more about that. I mean, for me, it's if we were doing culture audit, it's coming to the station and introducing ourselves to people so they know who we are as human beings. It means telling them why we're there, standing up with the gaffer and saying, this is what we're here for, this is what we're going to do. It's handing out briefing sheets to explain to people the sort of questions that we're going to ask so that there's no mystery about it. And then it's having conversations, private conversations with selections of people who are prepared to talk to us, and asking them both about their experience at work, what their hopes for the future are, and how they think it could change. So we sort of go from guessing what the problem is to actually understanding it. And then us coming back to you and saying, here's what we heard, here's what needs to be done in your culture, in your station, your local area, so that we are responding to what's really going on, not having to interpret what's going on. Jack, so that's a rather passionate answer, but I do feel quite strongly about it.
Thank you, Carrie. And we have just one more for Tim about social media in particular, because obviously, I mean, social media can be rife with speculation around some of these issues. How much energy and effort should services be putting in place to just manage the narrative online?
I think in a fast-moving story, which this will be, and it will feel very intense, this comes back to the importance of having your one good line to take, which will get you a very long way through a lot of the madness on social media. It's important to monitor what's being said on social media, very often not be drawn on it. The only reason I think you would be drawn, and this would be to get it offline, would be if someone was trying to make a disclosure in relation to what had happened to them because of the story, and they were trying to do that online. You see that happen sometimes. In almost all other cases, it's advisable to use the social media channel when you're in the heart of the story, to get your one line out, show that you get it, the problem, with empathetic language, own the problem, say what you would say if you saw it about someone else, say that about yourself, and pledge action. But you can restrict settings at this point. It can be important to ensure that it's not a great free-for-all, and then don't be drawn on further provocations. If your one line is good, if your strategy is a good one, that will get you through. But definitely keep a close on it. Just occasionally, we've had to have clients report things to the police on social media. But in this type of story, it's probably unlikely to arise.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Carrie, for your time today. Unless anybody's got any more questions, I think we just have a few concluding remarks. Thank you all for attending, taking the time. As I set out at the start, we're a specialist crisis communications agency, and obviously during any of these sorts of incidents and behavioural cultural issues, time is really precious. There are multiple competing demands on leadership in particular. I think we'd probably emphasise here from both a comms and kind of HR angle that anything you can do in terms of preparation is definitely worthwhile, because when it comes down to the crisis moment, you need as much time as possible to focus on all those stakeholder priorities. So as you can see on your screen, if you have any issues that you want a discreet, no obligation discussion about, please do contact us directly. We will be in touch after the webinar with a copy of the recording, if you'd like one. But otherwise, can I just thank again Tim Toulmin and Carrie Birmingham for their time today. If you have any questions, please do contact us directly. But otherwise, have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.